I still remember the sound of the clock in the kitchen, how loud it felt in the silence, how every second seemed to accuse me of something I hadn't yet admitted to myself. That night didn't arrive with drama. No storm. No raised voices. Just a quiet evening that ended differently than it should have. I've replayed it so many times over the years that the memories have worn thin around the edges, like a photograph handled too often. But the feeling, that part never faded. I'm sharing this now because some stories don't leave you alone until you give them a voice. And if you're here on Secret Woman Stories, maybe it's because you've carried something too, quietly, for longer than you ever planned. I was 26 then, old enough to believe I understood people, young enough to still trust them when I shouldn't have. I'd built a life that looked stable from the outside. A modest job, a small apartment, routines that kept me grounded. I was proud of how far I'd come. I thought that meant I was safe. I was wrong. It started with a phone call I almost ignored. I'd had a long day, and my body was already sinking into the couch when my phone lit up. His name sat there, familiar, harmless. Someone I'd known for years. Someone who'd watched me grow into myself, who'd always spoken gently, who felt safe. "I just need to talk," he said when I answered. His voice sounded tired, almost small. "Can I come by for a few minutes?" I hesitated. Something in me whispered no. But I ignored it, the way I'd been taught to ignore my instincts so I wouldn't seem rude, dramatic, or unkind. "Sure," I said. For a bit. When he arrived, nothing felt wrong at first. We sat at opposite ends of the couch. He talked about stress, disappointment, how life hadn't turned out the way he'd expected. I listened. I always listened. That was my role. The dependable one. The understanding one. At some point, the conversation drifted. The air changed. Not suddenly. Slowly, like a room growing warmer without you noticing until it's too late. He moved closer. I moved away. He laughed it off. I didn't. I remember the exact moment when I realized I was no longer in control of the situation. It wasn't when he touched my arm. It wasn't even when he ignored my silence. It was when I opened my mouth to speak and no sound came out. Fear does strange things to the body. Mine froze. My thoughts scattered. 1,000 responses raced through my mind. Say no, stand up, call someone. But none of them reached my voice. I won't describe what followed in detail. Not because it was dramatic, but because it was confusing. Because it didn't look like the stories people expect. There was no shouting. No obvious violence. Just pressure. Assumption. A complete disregard for the small, quiet signals I was giving. When it was over, he acted like nothing had happened. He stood up, adjusted his jacket, and thanked me for listening. As if the night had been ordinary. As if something inside me hadn't cracked open. After he left, I sat on the same couch until morning. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I just stared at the wall while the sky outside slowly changed color. That was the night I learned how heavy silence can be. If you're listening to this on Secret Woman Stories and your chest feels tight right now, please know, you're not imagining that feeling. Some stories recognize us before we're ready to recognize them. The days that followed were worse than the night itself. Every part of me wanted to tell someone, anyone. But every time I imagined opening my mouth, a second voice spoke louder. "Are you sure that's what happened? You didn't say no. People will ask why you let him in. You'll ruin everything." So I stayed quiet. I went to work. I smiled at co-workers. I answered texts. I laughed at jokes that barely reached me. On the outside, nothing had changed. On the inside, I was shrinking. What no one tells you about staying silent is how quickly you start to blame yourself. The questions replay endlessly. Why didn't I push harder? Why didn't I trust that first feeling? Why did I think being polite was more important than being safe? Weeks passed, then months. He still existed in my world, like a ghost everyone else could see but didn't fear. Occasionally, I'd hear his name mentioned casually, spoken with respect. Each time felt like a small betrayal. Not because anyone meant harm, but because they didn't know. And because I hadn't told them. I told myself I was being strong. that moving on quietly was mature. But the truth was uglier. I was afraid. Afraid of not being believed. Afraid of being reduced to a story I couldn't control. The silence began to shape me. I stopped trusting my judgment. I questioned my reactions. I grew cautious in ways that felt unnatural. I laughed less freely. I locked my doors twice. I replayed conversations, searching for danger where there was none. I thought time would erase it. Didn't. The turning point came years later, unexpectedly. I was sitting across from a friend at a cafe, listening as she described something that sounded painfully familiar. Her voice trembled as she spoke. She kept apologizing for being confusing, for not knowing how to explain it properly. I watched her shrink mid-sentence, and something in me broke open. For the first time I saw myself clearly, not as someone who'd failed to speak up, but as someone who'd survived something that was never her fault. That night I went home and said the words out loud, alone in my bedroom, to no one but myself. What happened wasn't okay. Cried then. Not the dramatic kind of crying, but the quiet, shaking kind that feels like your body finally letting go of a secret it's been holding hostage. I didn't report it. I didn't confront him. I didn't make a public declaration. My healing didn't look heroic. But I stopped blaming myself. I learned that silence is not the same as consent. That freezing is a response, not a failure. That being confused doesn't make you complicit. Over time I found my voice in smaller ways. I set firmer boundaries. I trusted my instincts again. I stopped explaining my discomfort just to keep others comfortable. The story still lives with me. Some nights it whispers. But it no longer defines me. This is why Secret Woman Stories exists. Because there are so many women carrying moments like this. Unfinished sentences, unanswered questions, truths they were never allowed to name. If you're listening and this story mirrors something you've lived through, you don't have to rush your healing. You don't have to explain yourself. But you don't have to be alone either. I never told anyone what really happened that night. Not fully, not publicly. But I told myself. And that changed everything. If this story spoke to you, please stay with Secret Woman Stories. Subscribe, listen, and share. Because your silence deserves understanding, not judgment. And tell me, if you had been in my place, what do you think you would have done? And what would you tell yourself now?